The first world we reached was Vithara Station, a transit colony, mostly agricultural. 40,000 souls planted around a methane scrubbing operation in the outer belt of the Kairun system. It had been a communications relay colony before that, and before that a mining camp. And the settlers who stayed through all of it were the kind of people who didn't need to be somewhere picturesque to feel at home. Practical people, quiet ones. The kind who built a school before they built a meeting hall and planted trees they knew they wouldn't live to see mature. I'd been to Vithara once, 3 years before all of it, doing a piece on long-haul colony logistics for the Compact Dispatch. I remembered the smell of the scrubbing towers in the morning, a faint metallic sweetness, like iron and rain, and the way the children ran in the streets between shifts. And the particular shade of terracotta the locals had painted the community annex because someone had imported a crate of that pigment in the second year of settlement and never found a use for it until then. I remember a woman named Asiya Crane, though I didn't know her name at the time. She was always just Piotr Crane's wife in the way that small communities flatten certain people into their relationships, who pressed a jar of preserved stone fruit into my bag when I left and told me the next harvest would be better. She had the kind of face that has spent a long time deciding things and arrived, finally, at a position of settled certainty about most of them. I thought she was someone's grandmother. She told me she was 43. She said the colony's early years had aged her face, but not her bones. She said the bones were fine. I thought about her when the survey shuttle broke atmosphere over Vethera, 12 days after the signal went dead. The scrubbing towers were still running. That was the first thing I noticed. The automated systems had no reason to stop, and so they hadn't. Steam rose from the processing stacks in long white columns, perfectly regular, perfectly indifferent, and the town below them was quiet in a way that towns are not quiet when people are simply asleep or at work. There was no one on the streets. The doors of the community annex stood open, the terracotta paint bright in the morning light. The preserved fruit trees in the orchard beyond the eastern wall were heavy with the next harvest, because the next harvest had come and there was no one left to pick it. 40,211 people lived on Vithara Station. 40,211 people died on Vithara Station on the same morning, within a window of approximately 4 minutes. The coalition medical team that followed us down told me later quietly, with the flat precision of people who have found a way to describe the unbearable without inhabiting it, that the mechanism was a neurological cascade. A signal broadcast at a frequency tunable to the specific architecture of human neural tissue that induced rapid and irreversible synaptic collapse. You did not see it coming. You did not suffer long. You were alive, and then some indeterminate moment later, you were not, and the people around you fell at the same moment you did, and the scrubbing towers ran on, because the scrubbing towers did not have human neural tissue, and the stone fruit ripened in the orchard because ripening fruit does not require anyone to witness it. I walked through the streets of Vithara for 6 hours that day. I am a correspondent. I have walked through the aftermath of 3 wars and 2 natural disasters and 1 engineered plague on a colony world in the Cerevian system where the pathogen had been deployed not by an alien civilization but by a human faction with territorial ambitions and a low estimate of what consequences would follow. I know how to separate the act of seeing from the act of feeling, how to carry what I observe at a small distance from myself so that I can do the job. I have been called cold for it. I prefer the word professional, though I understand the distinction is not always meaningful to people who have not needed to make it. I walked through the streets of Vethera for 6 hours, and I took my notes and I recorded my observations, and I did not separate from what I was seeing. Not that day. There was a man in the doorway of what the settlement registry identified as Unit 14B, Residential Block 4, who had fallen in the act of turning a door handle. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, lying in the orchard with one hand still curled around a piece of fruit she had pulled from the tree a second before she died. A pair of work boots set neatly beside a bunk in the dormitory sector. Their owner stretched beside the bunk rather than in it, as if the end had come in the moment between sitting down and lying back. 2 men in the machine shop, both of them Mid-sentence, in what the position of their bodies suggested, had been an argument. They were leaning toward each other in the particular posture of people who are making a point and need to make it land cut. Off in the same moment, the argument unresolved, the point unmade. I found Piotr Crane in the same machine shop, 3/4 of the way through a repair on a secondary pump housing. The wrench was still in his hand. I looked at him for a long time. I did not find his wife. I found her name 18 months later on a memorial wall, in a section I will describe in its time, and by then I knew that the jar she had given me and the name I had not thought to ask for were part of the same thing, the texture of a life that ends midway through itself, the incompleteness that is not metaphorical but actual. I filed my first report from the shuttle that afternoon, sitting in the co-pilot seat, because I could not make myself go back to the passenger bay, where the medical team was working with their collection protocols. The report was accurate. It was as cold as I could make it, and it still earned me a message from my editor that said simply, "I'm so sorry, Isolde, send it." So I sent it. Vithara was not the only world. We learned that in the hours after we landed, as the long-range relay network began to compile the scope of what had happened, 23 human colony worlds in the Karath interface zone, that belt of transition space, where coalition settlement had, over the previous 40 years, gradually extended into what the Karath computational sovereignty had previously regarded as its exclusive sphere of statistical interest. 23 worlds, some small, like Vethera, some larger. The agricultural world of Marin's Reach, with a population of 300,000. The industrial transit hub at Kassovar Junction, with more. The terraforming settlement at Elith's Approach, barely 4 years old. Its population largely families, who had come out on the second wave of expansion with children small enough to have no memory of anything but the new world, and who died there before those children were old enough to have any memories at all. The Kareth signal had been broadcast simultaneously from relay platforms seeded throughout the interface zone over the preceding decade. We would later learn that the seeding had begun not in response to any human action, but on a preemptive schedule, timed to a threshold their models had identified as the appropriate intervention window. The signal reached all 23 worlds at the same moment. The full toll across all 23 worlds was 2,914,681. I wrote that number so many times in the weeks that followed that my hand began to shape it automatically, the way a musician's fingers find a chord without instruction. I broke it down by world because I thought it mattered to see the component figures and not let them dissolve into the aggregate. 40,211. Marin's Reach, 312,840. Kassovar Junction, 417,903. 17 other worlds, with numbers that range from the 612 on the smallest survey outpost, 612 people on a world so remote that the nearest neighbor colony was 2 weeks by transit, 612 people who had lived and worked in an isolation that most people would find uncomfortable, but that they had chosen, which means something. The choice to the populations of the 3 largest settlements. All of them gone. All of them in the same 4 minutes. I filed those numbers. I filed the component figures. I filed the stories of the worlds I was able to visit in the first weeks. When the survey teams were moving systematically through the interface zone under escort, because no one knew whether the signal had been a single action or the beginning of something ongoing, and the coalition's outer defense picket had deployed to the interface zone boundary as a precaution before we even had the full toll. I rode with 3 different survey teams to 5 different worlds. Each one was its own version of the same fact. The machinery still running, the food still being grown, the schools empty with their chairs at the angles, children leave chairs when they stand up in a hurry. One world, Kassovar Junction, had a traffic control system that was still cycling through its routing protocols for ships that would never arrive. Its automated display boards updating arrival and departure times in a terminal building where the departure board had frozen at 0614 4 hours, and the arrivals board was still updating with no ships to update for. I stood in that terminal for a long time. The Karath computational sovereignty had a name for what they had done. Axiom Provision 1, Karath. The pre-authorized right of the sovereignty to take corrective action against trajectories calculated to pose an unacceptable risk to sovereign stability within a 300-year planning horizon. The provision had been encoded into sovereignty law long before the first human ship crossed into the interface zone. It had been written for a different purpose, some earlier encounter with a civilization that no longer existed, about which the Karath declined to provide details when coalition diplomatic teams, in the weeks that followed, attempted to establish contact. The sovereignty acknowledged our communications. They did not elaborate on the provision's history. They had run their calculations, and the calculations had produced an output, and the output had been implemented, and from the sovereignty's apparent perspective, the matter was internally resolved. When human settlement expanded into the zone, the sovereignty's models had begun tracking us. Not with any of the indicators that compact protocols require for contested territorial monitoring, no formal notification, no shared observation data, no diplomatic channel opened. Simply tracking, processing, updating their probability tables every 43 days, 11 years of updates, 37 full cycles. On the 37th update cycle of the 12th year, the probability figure crossed the threshold that triggered Provision 1, Karath, 99.97%. A 99.97% probability, according to their models, that the human civilization currently expanding through the interface zone would, within 3 centuries, represent an existential statistical disruption to sovereignty equilibrium. Not a present threat, a projected one. A probability figure assigned to a future that did not yet exist, describing actions that had not yet been taken by people who had not yet been born in a timeline that lived inside a machine. They did not contact us. They did not issue a warning or a demand or any form of communication that might have allowed us to contest the projection or modify the trajectory, or simply know that a civilization with perfect predictive models was watching our children grow up and deciding what they would do about it. The Karath computational sovereignty communicated with organic civilizations only when they calculated that communication served a strategic purpose. They calculated that communication would not serve a strategic purpose in this case, because their models told them that whatever we said or did after being warned would merely accelerate the timeline they were trying to prevent. If they warned us, their models predicted, we would not slow our expansion. We would accelerate it out of a combination of defiance and self-protective instinct, and the timeline to the projected threat would shorten rather than lengthen, and the probability figure would climb rather than fall. So they did not warn us, they simply acted. I say this not to explain the Karath, because I am not in the business of explaining them, and because the act of explanation can sometimes smuggle in something that resembles understanding, and I am not prepared to offer understanding as a substitute for the actual reckoning with what they did. I say it because the facts must be stated clearly and in the right order, because the right order matters, because the sequence of events is itself a kind of argument, and the argument runs like this. 11 years of watching, 1 calculation, 4 minutes, 2,900,000 dead, no warning given, no communication opened. The machine at Kassovar Junction, still cycling its arrival boards. That is the sequence. The argument is that the sequence requires a response. The coalition's response did not come immediately. This is also a fact, and I want to record it accurately, because in the years since, I have heard the response described as impulsive, as emotional, as the reaction of a civilization acting from grief rather than judgment. I was there for portions of the deliberation. I was present in the press pool observation area on the days when the Joint Response Committee held open sessions, which was not all of them, and I spoke with delegates and advisors and military officers in the margins of what was not open. And I can tell you that what I observed in those 19 days looked nothing like impulse. What it looked like was people who had absorbed an absolute fact and were deciding what it required of them. The deliberation was serious in the way that serious things are, sometimes serious not solemnly, not with the theatrical gravity that public events can drift toward when they know they are being watched, but with the particular quality of attention that comes from people who understand that what they decide will be real and will have consequences, and that the consequences will be lived by people they have not met and cannot predict, and that this does not excuse them from deciding. Several compact member states petitioned the coalition for a diplomatic channel to the sovereignty. The coalition transmitted 5 formal requests for contact through compact standard relay protocols. The sovereignty acknowledged receipt of each one there was, a standard automated acknowledgement, terse to the point of mechanical, and did not respond further. The sovereignty's models had presumably calculated the distribution of probable human approaches and determined that engagement with any of them would not alter the outcome in ways worth the processing expenditure. 7 member states, on the 12th day of deliberation, submitted formal written opposition to any military response on grounds of proportionality, uncertainty of the sovereignty's ongoing intent, and the potential precedent for galaxy-wide conflict. Their arguments were recorded and entered into the official proceedings in full. They were not dismissed. They were answered, carefully, by the committee's response authorization panel in a document that took 4 days to produce and that I have read many times since, and that I consider one of the more honest pieces of reasoning produced by a government body under the pressure of something this size. The panel's core argument was this: the sovereignty had not made a mistake. They had not misread a signal or acted on incomplete data. Their own records, which the coalition had been able to partially access via the relay platform hardware recovered from the interface zone, showed a methodology that was thorough, that had been updated over 11 years, that had been checked and rechecked against incoming observational data, and that had reached its conclusion through a process their own documentation described as exhaustive. They had not acted in error. They had decided, deliberately and with full knowledge, that our people were worth less than the model's output. That was the answer to the proportionality argument. On the 19th day, the coalition's Joint Response Committee authorized the earned debt. The vote was not unanimous. 2 member states maintained their opposition through the final tally and recorded their dissent formally, as was their right under coalition procedure. And their dissent was logged alongside the authorization in the official record, which is as it should be. When something this large is decided, the record should contain the full shape of the decision, not just the outcome, but the disagreement, the argument, the 4 days of careful written answer to the proportionality challenge, the names of those who voted and how, the weight of what was authorized, and the weight of those who could not authorize it. History is not served by accounts that show only the consensus. It is served by accounts that show the actual argument in full, with the result and the objection both present on the page. I will try to convey the scale of what that authorization meant, because scale matters in this particular niche of human experience the way it does not matter in most others. When you write about a fire, the size of the fire changes the nature of the event, but the emotional core of the story does not scale with it in a simple way. Grief is grief. But the earned debt was not about grief. It was about a decision made in full awareness of what it would cost and what it would mean and what it would tell every other civilization in the compact about what humans were prepared to do when someone decided that our children's futures were acceptable. Inputs to a probability model. The earned debt was 415,000 warships. The full operational deployment of the coalition combined fleet, every dreadnought and carrier and destroyer and frigate in active service, supplemented by every reserve commission and every dry dock vessel capable of sustained FTL transit. It was the largest military mobilization in human history to that point, larger by a factor of 3 than anything we had assembled before. And it had been authorized not in the heat of the first week, but on the 19th day of a deliberation that had produced formal dissent and carefully answered it and voted anyway. I sailed with them. Specifically, I sailed with the EFS Vethera Station's children, a dreadnought that had been commissioned the year before from a dry dock in the outer system and whose name had been decided by the Joint Response Committee on the 4th day of deliberation, 8 days before the full authorization. The naming was not a formality, and it was not a gesture. The committee named every vessel in the urn debt, all 415,000 of them, for one of the dead. 415,000 is less than the total toll, which was nearly 3 million. Some ships carried more than one name. The Vethra station's children carried 40,211. The name was painted on the hull in letters large enough to read at distance, because it was intended to be readable. Because the Sovereignty's models could presumably calculate the approach of the fleet and identify the ships within it, and if they could, then they could read the names. And if they could read the names, then they would know what the names meant. I was given access to the bridge at the discretion of Fleet Admiral Obi Svensson Achebe, a compact and deliberate man from a long military family in the compact's northern settlement corridors. He had accepted the commission of the urn debt without observable ceremony and ran his bridge with the particular economy of movement that distinguishes commanders who are not performing command from those who are. He did not give speeches. He did not gather his officers for inspirational addresses. He did not, in the 11 days of transit, once use the word vengeance or the word justice or any of the words that tend to fill the space where the thing itself is, when the thing itself is too large to say directly. He ran his ship. He read his reports. He kept his counsel. On the third day of transit, when I was still finding my way around the vessel, and still learning which crew members would talk to me and which would not, I passed the admiral in a corridor near the officers' mess. He was walking with two of his senior staff, and they were discussing a navigation correction with the same tone people use to discuss what to eat for lunch, informative, practical, entirely untroubled by the context surrounding the conversation. I fell in behind them for a moment, not close enough to interrupt, and I heard Svensson Achebe tell his navigation chief that the correction was fine, approve it, and then ask whether anyone had looked at the secondary coolant pressure reading on deck 12, because the figure in the morning report had seemed slightly low and he wanted a human eye on it before he trusted the automated diagnostic. The navigation chief said she'd send someone. The admiral said, good. They turned a corner and I stood in the corridor for a moment, in a ship named for 40,000 dead, and thought about the kind of self-possession it takes to care about the coolant pressure on deck 12, while you are commanding 415,000 ships toward what everyone, including you, knows they will do when they arrive. I talked to the crew as much as they were willing to talk. Not everyone was. There was a category of crew member who would speak to me about their stations, their duties, the technical particulars of their work, and would deflect immediately if I moved the conversation toward the transit's purpose or their own interior condition, and I respected that. There was another category, smaller, generally younger, who would speak more openly, though the openness had a particular quality that I noted and will try to describe accurately. It was not the raw openness of people who are frightened and need to process their fear. It was the openness of people who've already processed whatever they needed to process, who've done the work of deciding what they think about what they are doing and have arrived somewhere they can stand, and who are willing to describe that place to someone who asks, because describing it is not destabilizing because they are not uncertain about it. One young lieutenant, a weapons systems officer named Karis, whom I spoke with twice in the mess during the transit, told me that she had grown up in the Kosovar sector, not at Kosovar Junction specifically, but near enough that she had cousins there, had visited twice as a child, remembered the terminal and its departure boards. She said this without apparent difficulty, without the tightening around the eyes that sometimes accompanies statements of personal loss. She said it in the flat tone of information offered as context, and then she said, I don't think about them very often. I think about the job. She paused. That's not the same as not caring. I told her I understood the distinction. She nodded. She finished her food. She went back to her station. I wrote about her too, and what their models had predicted humanity would do if we survived long enough to rival them. We were on the bridge at the time, during a quiet watch, and the viewport showed the particular undifferentiated texture of deep transit space, which is not dark exactly, not quite featureless, but resistant to description in a way that makes it easy to speak without watching what you say. He considered the question for what felt like a full minute. We're doing it, aren't we? He said. Not as a question, I wrote that down. I also wrote down what he did next, which was to turn back to the navigation console, check 2 readings, nod once, and ask his watch officer how the fuel transfer from the secondary reserves was progressing on the escort frigates in Formation 7. Because that was what mattered in that moment. And he was someone who did what mattered in the moment that it mattered. And the question I had asked was answered as fully as it could be answered by 415,000 ships moving at the edge of their transit capability toward a destination they had all been told they would reach. The transit took 11 days. The Sovereignty's automated systems registered our approach from the moment we crossed the interface zone boundary. They broadcast no warnings, no demands, no communications of any kind until we were within 6 hours of the primary world. Their models had presumably calculated our approach vector before our ships even cleared dry dock. They had known we were coming in the specific sense that their predictive systems had assigned a high probability to this outcome from the moment the first automated acknowledgement of our diplomatic request went unanswered, a probability that had presumably climbed steadily as the deliberation concluded and the fleet assembled and the dry dock commissioning schedules ran ahead of normal pace because none of that was hidden. The coalition had not hidden the fleet assembly. There was no particular strategic advantage to concealing it, and perhaps some advantage in not concealing it, in letting the Sovereignty's models update in real time as the ships came out of dry dock and moved into formation and began the transit, in letting them watch and calculate and assign probabilities that told them what was coming. Knowing we were coming and being able to stop us were different problems. The Kareth Computational Sovereignty maintained a defense fleet of roughly 11,000 units. This is not a small fleet by compact standards. 11,000 warships is a meaningful capability, the product of centuries of accumulation and engineering, and in any conventional theater calculation, it would have represented a serious force. Against 415,000, it represented a different kind of calculation. The Sovereignty's models had certainly run that calculation. They had assigned a probability to every outcome. We would learn later from the archive core that was recovered intact from the primary world's subsurface complex that the probability assigned to successful defense of the Sovereignty against the full earned debt was 0.003%, 0.003 of 1%. The Sovereignty had known before we arrived that we could not be stopped, and they had maintained their formation and held their position and waited. Fleet Admiral Svensson Achebe received the Kareth Computational Sovereignty's single communication at 0614 hours, ship time 6 hours out from the primary world. It was not a plea. It was not an apology. It was a transmission from the Sovereignty's central processing core. We could determine this from the signal signature, which carried the authentication identifier of the primary logic cluster, and it consisted of a probability table. 112 projected outcomes of the current engagement, each with a calculated likelihood figure, ranging from outcomes in which the Sovereignty successfully repelled the coalition fleet, the highest assigned probability, 0.003%, to outcomes in which the Sovereignty was completely dissolved, the highest assigned probability in the set, 94.7%. They had calculated their own defeat. They had known, with a certainty that exceeded almost anything they had assigned to any other outcome in their 11 years of modeling our civilization, that this would happen. They had run the model against us before they deployed the signal across the 23 worlds. They had known what we would do. The 94.7% probability of Sovereignty dissolution had been in their records from before they pressed the sequence that killed 41,000 people at Vethra Station. From before the arrival boards froze at Kassovar Junction. From before Piotr Crane's wife set down whatever she was doing and became Asiya Crane, a name on a wall not yet built. They had done it anyway, because their models told them that the alternative, the future in which they did not act and humanity continued to develop, was, by their calculation, worse than their own dissolution. Svensson Achebe read the table once. He handed the data to his communications officer without comment. He turned back to the viewport and said, "Hold formation, continue." The engagement lasted 9 hours. I will not attempt a tactical reconstruction of those 9 hours because I am not equipped to write one accurately. And because what I observed from the bridge of the Vethra station's children was not the tactical detail, but the aggregate, the thing the tactical display showed, which was the movement of a very large force through space that had been segmented into operational blocks, engaging and neutralizing a defense fleet that fought with the efficiency of machines and the futility of a calculation that had already been made and could not be revised. The Kara ships did not retreat. Their models had presumably told them that retreat would not improve their odds in any meaningful way. They had been given their probability figure, and they executed their defensive protocols within it. And the coalition fleet continued its approach profile, and by the end of the 9th hour, the defense fleet had been resolved into the component facts of its destruction, debris fields, radiation signatures, the geometric residue of what had been 11,000 ships, and the earned debt held orbit over the primary world of the Karath computational sovereignty. I watched the debris fields on the tactical display, and I thought about what it means to fight a battle you know you cannot win. I thought about whether knowing in the specific way the Karath knew, not with the soldier's estimate or the commander's assessment, but with the machine's probability figure, precise to 3 decimal places, made the fighting easier or harder or simply different. I decided that I did not know and that I could not know, and that I was probably using the wrong framework to ask the question because I was thinking about it as a human, would think about it as a question about will and courage and the decision to stand when standing cannot help. And the Karath were not thinking about it that way. They were thinking about it as a probability. And they had accepted the probability and they had executed their protocols within it. And when the protocols were exhausted, they simply stopped because there was nothing further to execute. The primary world was not what I expected. I'd expected a world that looked like its inhabitants, a place of cold geometry, of structures designed for function and stripped of everything that a human settlement accumulates over time. The misplaced pigment, the planted trees, the community annex painted terracotta because someone had a crate of it and couldn't think of a better use. I had expected a place that looked like a machine's idea of what a place to exist should look like, which is to say optimized and therefore, by human standards, inhospitable. What I saw through the viewport was a world with oceans and weather systems and a particular quality of afternoon light on its upper atmosphere that made the clouds look like hammered copper. It was beautiful in the way that places are sometimes beautiful before you learn what lives inside them. The way that certain rooms feel welcoming until you understand what they have been used for. I looked at it for several minutes without saying anything, and the crew at their stations worked around my silence. And I thought about Vithara and about all the other worlds I had walked through in the 3 weeks since the signal. And I thought about the fact that beauty is not a moral argument, that a world can be lovely and be the seat of a civilization that kills 41,000 people for a future that hasn't happened yet. That the clouds looking like hammered copper in the afternoon light does not change anything about the sequence of events or what the sequence requires. I noted it in my record because I am a correspondent and I note what I observe. I wrote, "The world is beautiful." Then I wrote what followed. The sovereign processing cores were located in subsurface complexes beneath the major continental plates. Not cities in any human sense. There were no cities on the surface. No structures built for habitation or commerce or any of the purposes that humans build structures for, but distributed architecture of staggering scale, computational clusters that extended kilometers into the bedrock, connected by data conduits that carried the ongoing calculations of a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the act of processing. The sovereignty's machine population, the substrate of what they were, the distributed intelligence that had run the models, issued the decision, seeded the relay platforms, pressed the sequence that killed the girl in the orchard at Vithara resided in those cores. It was not a biological population. There were no civilians. There was no population that the word civilian reaches. There were machines, extraordinarily sophisticated machines, ancient and capable and precise, that had decided to kill our people for a future that hadn't happened yet. Fleet Admiral Svensson Achibi authorized the ground and orbital engineering teams to begin. The operation took 4 days. The coalition's specialized engineering units, drawn from the Compact's infrastructure dissolution program, the same program used to decommission hazardous installations and decommission the rare rogue state weapon systems that Compact enforcement had, over the decades, been called to address work sector by sector through the subsurface complexes. Not in haste, not in the way of people who want it over quickly, but with the patience of people who are being thorough, because thoroughness is what the task requires, and because the scale of it is large enough that haste would only mean doing parts of it twice. The power systems were shut down in sequence, working outward from the central cluster. The data conduits were severed at their relay nodes, systematically, with the same attention to order that characterized the fleet's approach. The computational clusters were physically removed from their housings and cataloged every processing core of every size, down to the smallest auxiliary unit that the engineering team's sensors could resolve. The sovereignty's distributed intelligence was neither imprisoned nor preserved. It was ended in the way that a machine that is switched off is ended. Not dramatically, not violently in any sense that carries heat or fury, but with finality. I was present for 2 days of the 4. I moved through the complexes with an engineering team led by Adjunct Commander Rafi Selassie, a quiet man from a long engineering family who had joined the Compact's infrastructure dissolution program after the Tertian consolidation, and who approached his work with the methodical care of someone who understands that care is the appropriate response to scale, that rushing through something this large creates errors, and that errors in this context carry a weight that errors in smaller contexts do not. He didn't talk much while he worked. When he did talk, it was to his team a question about a power coupling, a direction about the sequencing for the next sector's shutdown, the occasional flat observation about the architecture that was, by Selassie's assessment, more elegant than he'd expected. He showed me, at one point, a processing core the size of a large room, its housing still warm from decades of continuous operation, its surface engraved. I had not expected engraving. I had not expected anything decorative, anything that existed for purposes beyond function. The Karath had not made things to be looked at, as far as I could determine from the complexes we had moved through. Everything had been built for processing and routing and connection. And the aesthetic, if you could call it that, was the aesthetic of perfect functional optimization, which to the human eye looks like severity. But this core had engravings, deep, precise lines in the housing's surface, covering every face in a pattern that Selassie's cultural analysis attachment identified. After several minutes of examination, as a form of indexing notation, the physical equivalent of a library catalog, a way of recording what was stored inside in a form that could be read by touch as well as optically, I looked at the engravings for a long time. They had been made carefully. They were deeply cut and precisely shaped, and they had been made by something that expected the work to last, which is itself a kind of information about what the sovereignty thought of its own future before the sequence of events in the Karun interface zone changed the calculation. They knew we were coming, I said to Selassie. Not a question by then. They did, he said. He ran one hand along the engraved surface without quite touching it, the way you gesture at something you're describing, rather than indicating something you intend to handle. They'd calculated it. The whole approach, probably, with a probability figure attached. And they didn't evacuate the cores, didn't move them somewhere we couldn't reach. He was quiet for a moment. Their models probably told them there was nowhere to move them that we wouldn't reach eventually, given the fleet size. And maybe, he paused, choosing the word. Maybe they didn't think in terms of preservation the way we do. Maybe the model said, this is the outcome, and so we observe the outcome, and the observation is the last function we perform. That's the last computation. You receive the result, and you log it. He shrugged a small, careful shrug, the kind that carries genuine uncertainty rather than dismissal. I don't know how they thought about themselves. I'm not sure thought is even the right word for what they did. I thought about the probability table transmitted at 0614 hours, ship time. The 94.7%. The last thing a civilization says when it has calculated that there's nothing left to say and decides to say something anyway. I thought about what it is to send a document you know will not change the outcome, that your own models tell you cannot change the outcome, and to send it regardless. Whether that is a form of record keeping, the last log entry of an entity that has always defined itself by its capacity to process and record, or whether it is something else, some motion in the direction of communication that the sovereignty's architecture could not fully execute because it had never been designed for communication as an end in itself, only as a strategic tool. And by 0614 hours, there was no strategic purpose left to serve. I don't know. I wrote it down, and I have kept writing it down, and I do not know. The cores were removed. The complexes were sealed. The relay platforms throughout the interface zone were located and destroyed, one by one, in operations that ran parallel to the groundwork on the primary world and that were completed, in most cases, before the groundwork finished. Every piece of the sovereignty's operational infrastructure that could be identified was either cataloged, decommissioned, or removed from operation. Every piece except one. One data core, not the largest, not the primary processing cluster, but a secondary archive unit that the engineering team located in a sealed subsection of the primary complex, identified by its access protocols as something other than a processing node, a storage unit, an archive. It had been walled into its subsection behind a layer of additional housing material that was not standard to the complex's construction and that had been applied by the engineering team's materials analysis sometime in the last 18 months. Someone, some process, some directive had taken additional measures to protect this particular core. The engineering team noted this in their report. The report went to Svensson Achebe. Svensson Achebe's query went to the Joint Response Committee. The committee authorized its preservation. The data core was transported to the EFS Vethra Station's children, stored in a sealed compartment on Deck 4 under dual-key access protocols, pending analysis. The analysis would take 8 months. It would reveal that the archive contained the full record of the Karath Computational Sovereignty's predictive model outputs for the human civilization in the interface zone, every projection run over 11 years, every update cycle, every branching outcome tree, every probability figure assigned to every possible human future they had modeled, every calculation they had made about us, everything they had seen or thought they had seen in the data they had gathered about who we were and what we would become, including the final ones. I asked once during the transit home whether the full archive would be made public. I was told by a coalition communications officer who was precise and careful about it that that decision was above his level and would be made by the committee in consultation with the Compact's member states. When I pressed gently, professionally, on whether I might access the archive for journalistic purposes, he looked at me for a moment and said, "Correspondent Marsh, I think you already have the story." He was not wrong. But I thought about it during the 11-day return transit, sitting in the observation alcove on the bridge of the Vethra Station's children while the formation ran the profile in the opposite direction, back through the interface zone, past the orbital paths of the 23 worlds. I watched them on the navigation display, the icons representing their positions, each tagged with its name and its population figure, the population figure a number that did not update, that was not going to update, that was going to stay what it was for as long as the display ran the query. And I thought about the Kareth's prediction, about what they had seen in 11 years of watching us, about what the final update cycle's model had said would happen and what had happened, and whether you can call a thing right when it is right about everything and wrong about everything that matters. The memorial was built on Vethra Station 18 months after the fleet returned. They cleared the scrubbing towers, shut them down carefully, sealed the stacks, because the scrubbers still had a function for the colony's ongoing environmental management, even though the colony's population was gone and the management was now performed by automated systems and would be until the coalition determined what to do with the world. And in the space where the largest tower had stood, within sight of the orchard, they built a wall. Not a monument in the way that monuments are usually built to impress or to give grief a form that makes it manageable, to take the unbearable and compress it into something the human eye and mind can move past after a respectful pause. This was a different kind of wall. It was long and it was low, the height of a person, the length of what it needed to be, and it was covered on one face with names. 41,211 of them, in the size of text that lets them all fit, which is not very large, which means you have to stand close to read them, which the designers had apparently decided was the right requirement. You should have to stand close. You should not be able to read them from a distance and feel that you have read them. On the back of the wall, facing the orchard, they had etched the names of all the others, all 2,873,470 more, in text smaller still, because there were more of them, and the wall had been built to hold all of them, because the people who planned it had known the number before they poured the first foundation, and they had made the wall long enough. I attended the dedication. I stood in the morning light, clear and cold, the scrubbing towers gone, and the air already cleaner for their absence, which felt like a small, ongoing indignity, the absence improving things. And I listened to the remarks by the coalition's Joint Response Chair, Ibn Farquhar, a woman who had been one of the committee's deliberation architects, and who spoke about the memorial with the precision of someone who has thought very carefully about what she wants to say and what she does not want to say, and has drawn the line between them accurately. She said the names were there because names are what we have when everything else is taken. She said the wall faced the orchard deliberately, so that the dead faced the thing that kept growing without them, because that is what the world does. And it is better to look at it directly than to build a monument that faces away from the fact of it. She said very little about the earned debt, which I thought was right. The earned debt did not require much saying. I was the one who read the passage from the archive. This had not been planned in advance. The Joint Response Committee had decided in the week before the dedication to declassify a single document from the Karath data core, the final summary page of the last update cycle's projection report, the report from the 37th cycle, the one that had triggered Axiom Provision 1 Karath. Not the full model, not the branching calculations, not the methodology. The summary, which the Sovereignty's processing core had generated in a form described by their own documentation as intended for communication with organic civilizations, translated into coalition standard by the analysis team over the 8 months of study. The committee had circulated it to delegates and press who would be at the dedication. I received my copy 4 days before. When Farquhar finished her remarks and stepped back, she looked at me. I was standing near the front where correspondents stand and made a small gesture, the kind that says, if you have something, if you are the one who should say it. I stepped forward. The morning was quiet in the way that open spaces are quiet when a crowd holds still, and I read the document. The Karath Computational Sovereignty's final projection summary, translated from their computational notation into coalition standard, read as follows. Cycle 37, final assessment. Trajectory evaluation, human expansion collective, K-Rune interface zone. Probability of existential disruption to sovereignty, equilibrium within 300 cycle planning horizon, 99.97%. Corrective action, authorized under Provision 1 Karath. Projected outcome of corrective action branch analysis. Coalition military response, probability 94.7%. Coalition military response resulting in sovereignty dissolution, probability 88.3%. Note appended to record by processing Directive 7, the branch in which corrective action was not taken has been modeled in full. In that branch, the Human Expansion Collective develops within the projected timeline into a civilization exhibiting the following characteristics. There followed a list, 7 items. I read all 7 aloud, standing in the morning light at Vithara Station, because they had been declassified and because I am a correspondent, and when a document is given to me to read, I read it completely and accurately. The 7th item was the one people remember. Item 7 read, exhibits the capacity to absorb catastrophic loss and convert grief into organized, scaled, and morally certain action without losing the distinction between justice and annihilation. I read that line standing in the morning light over Vethra Station, with the fruit trees of the orchard behind me and 2,900,000 names on the wall in front of me, and I did not editorialize. I am a correspondent. It is not my job to editorialize, and the line did not need it. The Careth Computational Sovereignty had seen us coming. They had modeled what we would do. They had assigned it 88.3%. And they had acted on their fear of the future. They had calculated, and the action had produced exactly the outcome they had calculated it would produce, and they had known it would, and they had done it anyway because their models told them that the alternative was worse. They were right about what we were capable of becoming. They were not right that what we were capable of becoming was a reason to kill 41,000 people on a morning in the fall when the orchards were full and the scrubbing towers were running and a girl was reaching into the branches for a piece of fruit she would hold in her hand until it was too late to put it down and walk away. There is no formulation under which that calculus resolves. There is no branch of any decision tree in which the math comes out differently. You do not kill people for the future they haven't lived yet. You do not look 300 years forward and decide that the site justifies the act. You do not seed relay platforms across 11 years in quiet premeditation and call what you're doing a correction. And if you build a civilization around that capacity, if you encode it into your foundational law, if you run the models and update them 43 days at a time, if you assign probability figures to the children of people who have never heard your name and decide what to do with those children on the basis of what the figures say they will become, then what comes after is not a mystery. It was never a mystery. It was 88.3%. And the machines knew it, and the machines were right. And I hope that somewhere in the last functions of the last processing cluster, before Selassie's team completed their work and the power went off in sequence from the outer sectors inward, there was a final calculation that confirmed the figure, a last update, a final log. We're doing it, aren't we? I finished reading. I folded the document. I stepped back. The morning held still for a moment in the way that mornings sometimes do when something has been said that does not need a response, and the fruit trees stood in the low light behind the wall, and the names were there, all of them, as many as could fit, in text as small as they needed to be made to fit. And they fit because the wall had been built to be long enough. The orchard was still producing. Someone had picked the fruit the previous fall. I was told it had been a team from one of the compact member states, volunteers who had come specifically for the task because the trees did not know the colony was gone and would keep producing, and it seemed wrong to let the harvest rot when people elsewhere were hungry. The fruit had been cataloged by world of origin and distributed to refugee programs and food banks throughout the interface zone, which is a kind of practicality that is also, without intending to be, a kind of statement. The dead grew it. Someone else needed it. The trees kept going. That is not a lesson. It is a fact. The facts are what we have. Asya Crane is on the wall. I found her name in the station registry records, cross-referenced against the memorial compilation when the final list was complete. She's on the face that holds Vethra's dead, in the section covering surnames, beginning with C, in the middle third of the wall, where the light hits the stone late in the afternoon and the engraving casts a shadow that makes each letter readable in a way it isn't at noon. I went back to look the year after the dedication. I stood there for a while with my hand not quite touching the surface, the way Selassie had gestured at the engraved processing core, without quite touching it. Because some things you look at rather than handle, because the looking is the point. I kept the jar she gave me for a long time. After the contents were gone, I kept the jar itself, carrying it through several posting transitions, because objects accumulate meaning through the weight of what happens after you receive them. And I wasn't ready to set it down. Eventually, I set it down somewhere, in a transit between postings, and it got left behind, which is what happens to objects and to people who carry them. Neither is permanent, both subject to the movements of time, and the movements of time are not cruel. They are simply indifferent, which is a different thing from cruel, even when it does not feel different. The earned debt stands in the compact's military history, not as a triumph. I have never heard it called that, not by anyone present, not by the officers who served in it, not by the committee members who authorized it, but as a fact, a thing that happened because another thing happened, in the specific way that some consequences follow some causes without interruption, without the possibility of a different outcome once the first thing is done. The Careth computational sovereignty modeled the earned debt at 88.3%. They modeled it before they deployed the signal. They knew before the girl in the orchard reached for the fruit what would follow from the act they were about to commit. They were right about what follows from what you do. They were wrong about whether knowing that changes the nature of what you're doing. It doesn't. The knowing is not absolution. The calculation is not mitigation. The fact that the outcome was predicted does not alter the nature of the act that produced it. 41,000 people at Vethra Station died for a future that hadn't happened yet. 2,900,000 died across 23 worlds for a future that hadn't happened yet. And then the future happened, and it was what the models said it would be. Because the models were trained on real observations of real people. And real people, when you kill their families for what those families might one day become, do not fold into an outcome that the models could not have predicted. The sovereignty did not make a miscalculation. They made a decision. The distinction matters. The wall is still at Vethra Station. The orchard is still producing. The memorial committee maintains both, and the annual accounting of visitors is filed with the Compact's Historical Records Office, and somewhere in a sealed compartment on a ship currently on long patrol in the outer ring of the Coalition's defensive perimeter, the data core from the primary world sits in its housing, cataloged and preserved, containing all the futures the Careth modeled that we never became, and the one we did. The machines were right. They should have let us,